I'll be at the UN, where we'll be talking about that Africa that I was talking about 26 years ago, which hasn't gone away, is still with us painfully. But down in Washington, I've been talking about the other Africa that emerged in particular over the last 26 years. And while it's correct that we deal with that painful part of Africa where 12 million people tonight will not have anything to eat, and we're all very aware of that, we also must deal with that other side of Africa, which quite conceivably is the last place on this planet where money can go, invest in the dynamism, creativity and productivity of a people that have yet to be touched with the benefit of jobs. And that's what we're here to talk about today. It may be odd. It's always very daunting for me to talk to an audience of Africans. They're sort of thinking, you know, what's he got to say to us about anything? I was talking to my friend who's here with me. It's like as if an African guy showed up to a bunch of Irish people and started talking to them about Ireland. But it's just as valid. The arc of my particular narrative is that I was drawn to the continent by the horrific pictures of 26 years ago. It seemed unconscionable to me that we could allow 30 million people to die of want in a world of surplus. That was not only intellectually absurd, it was economically illiterate, and it was also morally repulsive. I was in a pop group. The thing that I could do was write songs and talk to a very broad constituency through those songs. And when I gathered my colleagues together in 1985 to address this human wound that was happening across the Sahel, many people responded in a massive outpouring of shared humanness rather than shared humanity. And it was at that point that I started traveling throughout this glorious continent. And what I discovered was something that impedes the development, the business development, the economic development. And we can go through, and I know that all throughout today there are people far more knowledgeable and more erudite than I am about why investment is impeded, what to do structurally, what to do with commercial law, commercial courts that doesn't allow for investment. But the main thing that disallows investment is the impression of this continent that it is hopeless, that it is shackled, that it will never grow. That simply isn't true. And it was a long learning curve. And by the end of my own personal narrative, having, as I was introduced, joined with Kofi Annan at the Africa Progress Panel and the Millennium Development Goal Panel and Tony Blair's Commission for Africa, I moved from just charity to policy, and with Bono we set up the One campaign, which has 72 people here on the Hill in Washington and 26 in London, 8 in Berlin, 6 in Paris, 4 in Brussels and 10 in Africa, to just focus on policy. And the last part of what I could do was to talk to people about this other Africa of 1 billion intellectual, creative, elegant, dynamic, productive human beings. 1 billion people, 50% of whom are under 16, the fastest urbanizing continent in the planet. A continent that required everything. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is quite clear in the second decade of the 21st century that we are facing a perfect storm of social challenges. Terrorism, nuclear proliferation, an existential and fundamental collapse of the world economic system. It's not just a glitch of the system. It is a fundamental dismantling of a hitherto functioning system. Now, change can blow in from anywhere, and the least thing it does is to test leadership, and the most is to impose change. Leadership is wanting throughout the entire world. We are seeing it everywhere. We're seeing it at the UN today. We're seeing it in Europe today. We're seeing it in the United States today. We see chronic lack of decent leadership in many African countries. Yet it is fundamental, especially at a moment of existential global terror. And I would argue that the economic crisis is simply a form of economic terrorism imposed on the global population. And the terrorists are in the banks and in the political circles. And people are terrified. And it's odd, as your last speaker said, that you have nowhere else to go. There's only one place left. There's only one place that doesn't have an industrial or a technological legacy that they have to overcome before they can rebuild. And I know what this is, because in Ireland, we weren't allowed to develop under British rule. We had to be the breadbasket specifically for London. In the north of the island, those people were loyal and they were allowed to develop industry. And so you had the great shipyards of Belfast building the Titanic and other great ships. You had the great flax industries and linen industries of Northern Ireland. But in the south, we were rebellious, so that we could never get rich. We were never allowed to industrialize. But when new technologies came along, we were educated. We were young. We had low taxes. We had commercial law. And we were in Europe, and we were English speaking. Dell and Microsoft and Apple have still not left Ireland, and the productivity of that country, pro rata, today is higher than Germany, though we are utterly bankrupt. Now, there are similarities in the continental situation in Africa, but the problem is one that I am partially responsible for and can address, and that is one of perception, what they constantly say in Washington, optics. You see, when people perceive Africa, they perceive the dark continent. But the darkness is in their heads. They see only corruption, and yet corruption in China is 13% of GDP. Corruption in Africa is 6%, 7% continental-wide. 6 or 7% too much for sure, but an impediment to development. It doesn't stop it. They see conflict. But when I arrived in 1984, there were 21 wars, and I walked through the longest-running war of the 20th century in Ethiopia. There are 3 major conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, a vast, vast space of 24, 27 countries. Name me a country in Asia that is not in conflict. 1, Singapore maybe. But the others, the touchstone of the next conflict may be Israel-Palestine. I would suggest it's Pakistan, Kashmir, India, Afghanistan, and China. Not Africa. So they see corruption, but they see gold in China. They see conflict, but they see wealth in Asia. There's a mismatch here, and it's a media perception. On the train down from New York this morning, Pakistan, UN, Israel, Palestine, collapse of the world markets, page 3, a starving infant from Africa. Now, the reason you have the starving child is because it is in the embodiment of innocence. It isn't because they're African. They don't see an African child, they see an innocent, a pure, innocent human being. That's good. But 2 steps away from that, the first step being, I want to help, is it's Africa, it's a problem. And this is essentially the problem of investment into Africa.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.